There was a part of Kentucky in 1798 that even the bravest riders avoided. Nestled beyond the thick black trees of what they called Devil's Ridge, surrounded by silence and shadows, lay a patch of land known to few as Ashbrook Hollow. It didn't appear on most maps, and locals never spoke of it unless they were drunk or dying. Those who lived near it, if they could be called neighbors, spoke only in vague warnings: keep moving. They'd mutter to passing travelers, and don't follow the split road past the sycamores. That split road led to a farm. To any passerby, Ashbrook Hollow looked like a modest homestead. Acres of tall grass, weather beaten barns, smoke rising from a chimney that never seemed to go out. The fence was always mended, the field always freshly plowed, and the white farmhouse sat like a ghost watching over the land, still pristine, hiding something it refused to confess. The Miller family owned that farm. Ezekiel Miller, the patriarch, was a man with coal-colored eyes and hands that had buried more secrets than seeds. His wife, Miriam, was a pale, silent woman who never blinked long enough for anyone to read her soul. Their 3 sons, Daniel, Elias, and Levi, were built like oxen and spoke as little as they smiled. They were rarely seen in town, and when they were, they spoke only to trade or recruit laborers for the farm. Most of those who left with the Millers never returned, but no one could ever prove a thing. In those times, the wilderness ate people: bandits, bears, starvation. They were all common ends, and if a farmhand disappeared, folks figured he ran off, got lost, or was swallowed by the land. Still, whispers grew. Too many people went missing after heading toward Ashbrook Hollow. Too many rumors about wagons going in full and coming out empty. Some travelers described seeing strange smoke, hearing screams at night carried on the wind. But without bodies, there was no crime. Without evidence, no one dared challenge the Millers. That fear allowed evil to grow bold. The truth was that the farm wasn't a refuge, it was a carefully constructed trap. The Miller family didn't just work the land, they harvested people: drifters, immigrants, women with no kin, orphans. They offered a warm meal and a bed of hay, then locked their victims away. Some were robbed and buried. Others were sold, used in ways too horrific to name. The barn had a false floor. The well held secrets not even the coldest rain could wash away. Behind the house was a tool shed with iron restraints and chains so rusted they told a story of decades. Ashbrook Hollow wasn't a farm. It was a graveyard that fed off silence. But why did no one stop them? Because in 1798, justice didn't ride out without cause, and the Millers made sure no one ever had enough to cry for help. They were respected by the few who knew them, feared by the rest, and always just clever enough to mask their crimes as misfortune. No lawman would risk a ride out for rumor alone. No court would condemn a family with clean clothes and a tidy field. It would take someone on the inside, someone no one noticed, a child, a girl, a quiet set of eyes and ears that saw what the world chose to ignore. But on that stormy Kentucky land, hidden past the sycamores, the Miller family continued to feast on the forgotten. Their evil wasn't loud. It was quiet, patient, generational, and each passing day their confidence grew, until a spark was lit inside one of their victims, a spark that would burn through the lies, the fear, and the twisted roots of Ashbrook Hollow itself. The farm beyond the trees looked peaceful, but inside its walls, hell was harvesting souls, and the world was about to remember it. Her name was Annalise Reed, and she was only 12 when she was left at the gates of Ashbrook Hollow. Her mother had died from consumption, her father a traveling peddler who vanished after heading west. No siblings, no kin, just an orphan with 2 threadbare dresses and a Bible tucked beneath her shawl. She was dropped off by a trader who owed Ezekiel Miller a favor. That's how children arrived at Ashbrook Hollow, quietly with no questions. To the Millers, she was just another mouth to control, another soul to break. But they underestimated her. Where most children flinched and obeyed, Annalise watched and remembered. She was small, barely tall enough to reach the top of the chicken coop, but her mind was sharp. She said little, pretended to be slower than she was, and quickly learned the rhythms of the farm, where the keys were kept, when the barn doors were locked, who came in late at night, and who never left. The farmhouse, with its creaking floors and always closed cellar door, held secrets she wasn't meant to find. But children hear what adults dismiss. They slip through cracks, hide behind barrels, peer through keyholes. Annalise saw things she couldn't unsee. She saw Daniel Miller drag a man with a bloodied face into the barn after dark. She watched Miriam, with her sunken eyes, pour strange powders into mugs meant for new workers. She heard the cries, dull, muffled sobs behind walls that no sunlight reached, and worst of all, she saw what lay beneath the floorboards of the tool shed when the wind blew them open one night, a shallow pit stacked with bones and the stench of death. It would have broken most children, but Annalise held on to one thing that even the Millers could not erase: her will to survive, and deeper than that, her desire to bring justice for those who had vanished before her. She started to leave small signs for herself. She etched names she overheard into the barn rafters. She collected scraps of cloth from missing people's belongings and buried them beneath the orchard trees in a pattern only she could recognize. She memorized faces, accents, songs sung by victims on their first day. Each night before she slept, she prayed not just for her own soul, but for the strength to remember those who no longer could speak for themselves. Time passed. Months turned into a year. Annalise knew escape had to be careful. Rushed attempts meant death. She watched what directions travelers came from, traced how long it took riders to reach the farm after disappearing from the main road. She studied the stars and mapped the land in her head. Then, one summer evening, the moment came. A thunderstorm rolled in. The Miller men were out chasing down a runaway horse. Miriam was ill and bedridden. The house was quieter than ever. Annalise moved. She stole the cellar keys from beneath the kitchen hearthstone. She crept down into the earth, past crates of salted meat and jam jars, and found cages. 3 of them, all occupied, 2 girls, one barely older than her, another a woman in her 30s, weak and dazed, the third, a boy maybe 15, barely conscious. Annalise opened the cages, helped them to their feet. Whispered, "We run, now." They made it through the field, over the back ridge, into the black trees. The storm covered their footsteps, and for the first time in years, someone made it out of Ashbrook Hollow alive. They walked all night. At dawn, they reached a trading post. A sheriff's deputy happened to be there, drinking coffee before patrol. The sight of the children, bruised, bloodied, wide-eyed, stopped him cold. Annalise looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I know where the bodies are buried." She told everything. The sheriff didn't believe her at first, but when his men rode to the farm, they found the pit behind the shed. They found the cages. They found the blood. The Millers were arrested, tried, and later hanged. Ashbrook Hollow was burned to the ground, but Annalise Reed lived. She testified in court with a calmness that silenced the room. She became the voice for the missing, the spark that ended a legacy of horror. She never returned to the farm, but she never stopped speaking the names of those who had vanished, because she had seen too much. And she refused to let the world forget it. There was nothing fancy about it, just a small leather-bound book, worn at the corners and stitched together with coarse thread. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded in places, and yet it carried more weight than any courtroom testimony or sheriff's report ever could. It was Annalise Reed's journal, and on every line of every page there was a name. Not of the powerful, not of the famous, but of the forgotten. She called it the Journal of Names. She began writing in it shortly after escaping Ashbrook Hollow, after testifying, after the trials and the public spectacle. When the newspapers had moved on and the people of Kentucky tried to pretend they'd never heard of the Miller family or their farm of horrors, Annalise found herself alone in a quiet boarding house, staring at the ceiling through sleepless nights. She couldn't let it go. The silence in her mind was loud. Every scream she heard from the cellar, every glance of a prisoner's eyes through the slats, every time she saw Daniel Miller carry a new face through the gate, only for it to disappear the next day. She remembered them all, and she knew most of them would never be identified. No official record, no family asking questions, drifters, migrants, poor farmers, enslaved men and women who had just gone. So she began to write them down. Not just names, but everything she could remember, where they came from, what they wore, the way they smiled, little details that made them human again. She gave identities back to those the Millers had tried to erase. There was Isaac, who sang lullabies in German when he thought no one was listening. Maya, who gave Annalise a ribbon from her hair as a promise of hope. Thomas, who could juggle stones and made the children laugh even with bruises on his face. Auntie Ruth, who had no teeth but prayed louder than anyone Annalise had ever met. She never wrote about the Millers, not once, because the journal wasn't about death. It was about life, their memory. Each page was a resistance to silence, each word a resurrection of the truth. As the years went on, the journal grew. Annalise traveled as she grew older, working as a teacher, then a midwife. In each town, she listened. When someone whispered about a cousin who vanished near the Kentucky woods, she asked questions. When travelers passed through with stories about missing sisters or friends who disappeared after being hired on a farm, she took notes. Her room always had that journal tucked beneath the mattress. If you ever asked her what it was, she'd simply say, "It's where the truth lives." What made the journal powerful wasn't just the sorrow, but the hope in its pages. For each person she named, she vowed to light a candle, to speak their name out loud once a year, to pray that wherever their souls had gone, they knew they had not been forgotten. Eventually, others joined her. By the time she was in her 40s, Annalise had founded a quiet circle of women who carried on her work. They called themselves the Remembrance Sisters. Each one carried a copy of the journal, and each added new name. The network spread from Kentucky to Tennessee, then Ohio, Missouri, and beyond, and though they never made headlines, they found missing children, reunited separated families, stopped others who tried to follow in the Miller family's footsteps. The Journal of Names became a movement, one rooted in dignity, in truth, and in the idea that no matter how dark a crime, someone had to remember the victims. Someone had to write it down, speak it, keep it sacred. In her old age, Annalise passed her original journal to a local church. It was placed in a glass case, open to a page that simply read, "They tried to bury them, but we are the ones who will unearth the truth." Children would walk by and ask who the people in the journal were. And the answer was always the same: they were people who mattered. Even if the world didn't think so, Annalise never sought fame. She never published a book, but her journal outlived her. And the ripples of her courage continue in every name remembered, in every story told, in every injustice made visible. Because truth doesn't die when evil is buried. It lives in ink, in memory, and in hearts like Annalise's. The wind howled across the ridge that night like a wounded beast, carrying with it the scent of old blood, wet earth, and something darker, something final. It was November 12th, 1798, the night when the ashes of the Miller farm would mingle with justice, and the whispers of the past would be scorched into memory. The day had been unusually still, almost unnaturally so, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The sun sank behind the black treetops of Ashbrook Hollow, and the darkness came early, too early, for those who knew the truth, the townsfolk who had dared to believe Annalise Reid, the survivors who had emerged from the nightmare. It was the eve of reckoning. That night didn't begin with fire. It began with footsteps, silent ones. 6 men, wrapped in wool cloaks and grim determination, crept through the backwoods toward the Miller farm. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. They'd all lost someone, a brother, a daughter, a friend who'd never come home. Their faces were tight with anger, not for vengeance, but for the unbearable silence that had followed the truth. The law had moved too slow. The Millers, despite being exposed, still stood behind their porch, daring justice to knock. The sheriff claimed he needed more evidence. The judge claimed his hands were tied. But the people were done waiting. As they approached the farm, the night air thickened with dread. The twisted oak trees seemed to lean in to listen. The windows of the Miller house were dark, save for one faint glow in the attic, a flickering candlelight that looked almost like an eye watching. Inside, the Millers were finishing supper. Nathaniel Miller, the patriarch, leaned over his stew like nothing was amiss. His wife, Maura, spooned silence into her bowl, her hands trembling just slightly. They had heard the rumors in town, they had seen the stares, but they believed their fear had passed, that the worst was over. It wasn't. The men didn't kick in the door, they waited for the smoke to do the talking. The barn was first. A jug of oil, a bundle of hay, and a match struck in the name of the lost. Within seconds, the dry wood caught, and a hungry blaze leapt into the night sky. The horses screamed. Flames licked at the old timbers like a beast awakened. The fire wasn't just destruction, it was an alarm, a signal, a roar. The millers rushed outside in confusion, their eyes widening as they saw the inferno. But then they saw the shadows of the 6 men in the distance, silent, still, unmoving. And Nathaniel knew this was the end. He turned to run back into the house, perhaps to grab something, perhaps to escape through the back cellar. But Maura stood frozen, her hands at her chest, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. Or maybe a confession. Then came the second fire. The main house was next. It started at the base, where the secret room had been found, where the chains still hung from the stone wall. The fire spread fast, too fast. It was as if the evil inside had made the wood brittle, eager to burn. Inside that house were years of secrets, of ledgers, names, and horrors that could never be fully told. But that night it all turned to flame. Annalise stood far down the ridge, watching with tear-filled eyes. She hadn't lit the match, but she didn't stop it either. For years, the house had haunted her dreams, and now it was finally being consumed by something more powerful than fear, the flames of remembrance. As the roof collapsed, sending embers high into the stars, the people of Ashbrook Hollow gathered silently in the field, not to cheer, not to curse, but to witness, to stand with the ghosts. No bodies were ever recovered that night. Some say the millers escaped into the woods. Others believe they perished in the flames. What remained the next morning was only rubble, ashes, and scorched earth. But the town changed after that. The silence was broken. People began speaking the names they had once buried in shame. Families returned to the place where they had once grieved in secret. Annalise's journal became sacred, and where the house once stood, the community built a circle of stones, one for every known victim and many more unnamed. The night of the fire became a date etched in every heart, a night not of revenge but of release, because some places are too evil to rebuild, some houses too dark to be mended, but from those ashes new seeds were planted. Of courage, of memory, of truth, and the people of Ashbrook Hollow never looked away again. The trial began on a stormy morning in early February 1799. The courthouse in Lexington, Kentucky, a modest 2-story stone building, was swarmed with spectators, journalists, and grieving families. What had started as hushed rumors from Ashbrook Hollow had now captured the attention of an entire state. The people of Kentucky were about to witness a reckoning unlike anything they had seen before. Nathaniel and Maura Miller, once respected landowners, sat in the defendant's bench, shackled, pale, and silent. Their faces revealed nothing, not even when the names of the missing were read aloud. 17 names. 17 souls who had vanished over the span of 10 years. Most were travelers. A few were young women looking for work. Some were orphans the Millers had taken in, supposedly out of charity, but none of them were ever seen again. The prosecution's case was chilling. They presented the journal of Annalise Reed, the young girl who had escaped the Millers' captivity and blown the lid off the nightmare hidden behind that quiet farm. Her journal described in harrowing detail the secret cellar, the ledger of names the Millers kept, the screams in the night, and the manipulation Maura used to trap her victims. But what turned the tide was not just her words. It was what she brought with her when she fled. A rusted key and a lock of blood-matted hair. The courtroom gasped when both were laid out on the table before the jury. Experts confirmed the hair belonged to one of the missing girls, and the key fit the cellar door that authorities found beneath the charred remains of the Miller house. The defense tried to argue that Annalise had fabricated the story, that she had a vendetta against the Millers. They claimed the journal was forged, that the key was planted, but then came the witnesses, dozens of them. Townsfolk who had long suspected something was wrong. Traders who'd noticed travelers heading to the Miller farm but never returning. Even the local blacksmith recalled forging iron chains based on odd sketches Nathaniel had brought him. Then came the moment that shattered the courtroom's composure. The prosecution presented a hidden box unearthed beneath the Miller barn just 2 weeks prior. Inside were personal items, rings, journals, and small trinkets belonging to the missing. Some of them were recognized instantly by family members sitting in the front row. Tears flowed, cries echoed. A mother fainted as her son's pocket watch was held up in silence. But the most damning evidence came when one of the prosecution's final witnesses took the stand. It was Elijah Croft, a farmhand who had worked for the Millers for 2 years before mysteriously leaving town. No one had heard from him since, but now, grizzled and guilt-ridden, he took the stand and swore under oath that he had seen with his own eyes 2 victims locked in the cellar. He had tried to intervene, but Maura had threatened him, and his own sister, so he ran. When asked why he had returned now, his voice cracked. "Because I couldn't carry it anymore. The truth was rotting me alive." The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the silence in the courtroom was so thick it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The foreman stood, glanced toward the defendants, and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted, some in tears, some in sobs, others in long-held sighs of relief. The judge sentenced both Nathaniel and Maura Miller to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on the 17th of February, in full view of the public. It was one of the most severe sentences ever passed down in the state's young history, but few protested. The people needed closure, the souls lost needed justice. The trial was later documented in newspapers across the country, earning it the name, "The Trial That Shook Kentucky." Historians, criminologists, and clergy debated for decades how such evil could exist under the veil of a normal farm. But for the people of Ashbrook Hollow, there was no mystery, only memory. The memory of friends who disappeared, of nights where screams were mistaken for wind, and of a family that had hidden monstrous cruelty behind polite smiles and prayer. But justice, even delayed, had arrived. And as the gallows were built just outside the city courthouse, the entire state watched and remembered. Not just the Millers, but every name carved into the memorial stones that now stood on the ashes of the farm. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about finally being seen, it's about truth. No matter how long it takes to come to light, there was something haunting about her silence. Annalise Reed didn't scream the day she escaped. She didn't cry, she didn't run wild through the trees. She walked slowly, carefully, every step measured, every breath controlled, because for 7 months she had lived in a world where even the sound of her breathing could cost her life. The Millers had stripped her of her voice, her identity, her hope, but they had not killed what mattered most. They hadn't killed her will. What fear couldn't kill in Annalise was the most fragile and yet powerful part of her, her belief that she was more than what they made her endure. Every morning she woke up on that blood-soaked farm in the pitch-black cellar with walls that whispered of screams. She reminded herself that she was still human, even when treated like something less. She was only 15 when she first arrived, an orphan promised a place to work and a roof over her head. What she found instead was a nightmare woven into routine, Nathaniel's cruel silence, Maura's deceiving kindness. The meals given as rewards, the punishments that followed disobedience, the ledger where names were crossed out, and the other girls whose eyes were hollow from years of captivity. But in that place, where most would be shattered, Annalise chose something else. She chose to listen, to remember, to observe. Even in terror, she remained awake. She memorized the creaks in the floor above her. She noted how long it took Maura to make her rounds. She saw which keys opened which doors. She paid attention to the pattern of Nathaniel's boots and the sound of his voice when he lied. She studied the weakness in the chain that bound her ankle, the soft crack in the wood panel above her head, the location of the cellar door when no one else was watching. Because she knew something others had forgotten, fear doesn't win unless you surrender, and she wasn't going to surrender, not yet, not ever. One night, during a thunderstorm, Annalise made her move. Maura had dropped her candle too close to the edge of the floor. The flame had sputtered. Annalise pretended to sleep but kept her eyes open. When the footsteps faded, she reached for the piece of metal she had hidden weeks before, a nail sharpened against stone. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, from the urgency of freedom. It took her an hour to pick the lock on the chain. Her wrists bled, her hands shook, but she didn't stop. She didn't think of what might happen if she failed. She only thought of what might happen if she didn't try. When the cellar door creaked open, she climbed out barefoot, soaked in silence. She moved through the house like a shadow, past the portraits of the Millers, past the rooms where other victims had vanished, past the cabinet where Maura kept the box of memories, the belongings of the lost. Annalise took a ring, a lock of hair, and the journal she'd secretly kept beneath the cellar stone. Then she ran through the cornfields, across the dead creek, beyond the tree line, and when the morning sun broke through the fog, she found herself on the edge of Ashbrook Hollow, facing a man who nearly shot her out of fear. But she spoke. For the first time in months she used her voice, her real voice, and she said, "They're still down there, please help them." The man wept, the town listened, and the horror unraveled. What fear couldn't kill was what ultimately saved not only Annalise but the truth itself. Because truth had been buried for too long under lies, under reputation, under the illusion that evil couldn't exist behind such charming faces. But it did, and it nearly got away with it. Annalise's courage, born in darkness, forged in silence, was the light that exposed it all. Fear tried to crush her spirit, but it didn't understand something vital. Fear can break bones, it can silence mouths, but it cannot kill resolve. Not when someone believes in who they are, even in the midst of evil. Today, her name lives on not just as a survivor, but as a savior of truth. A young girl who reminded the world that when fear rises, you rise higher.